Hello, welcome back to another section of The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Hope you are enjoying the beginning of this book with me. We've done 2 sections thus far, so if you are just joining us for the first time, hi, I'm Julie. I read books over here. Happy to have you join us. And if you want to start from the beginning, just go back a couple videos. I will try to get a playlist made soon as well, so you can start from the beginning and get caught up. If you're liking this book, give me a little thumb, subscribe so you can catch the rest. And yeah, we are on page 52. We're at the very top of the page if you're in a copy such as this one. There was just the end of a sentence from the previous paragraph following into that page, but otherwise we're starting right at the top of page 52 here. So not sure exactly how far we'll get in, but we'll definitely finish this chapter as well as start the next chapter a little bit. So no further ado, The General in His Labyrinth, let's go. At 5 o'clock, when Jose Palacios brought him his first tisane, he found him resting with his eyes open. But the general tried to stand up with such force that he almost fell on his face, and he suffered a severe attack of coughing. He sat on the hammock, holding his head in his hands and coughing until the crisis passed. Then he began to drink the steaming infusion, and his humor improved with the first sip. "I was dreaming about Cassandro all night," he said. It was his secret name for the New Granadan, General Francisco de Paula Santander, who had been his great friend at one time and his greatest gainsayer of all time, his chief of staff from the very beginning of the war, and the man he appointed president of Colombia during the cruel campaigns for the liberation of Quito and Peru and the founding of Bolivia. For more reasons of historical necessity than of vocation, Santander was an effective and brave soldier, with a rare fondness for cruelty, but his civic virtues and his excellent academic training were the mainstays of his glory. He was, without a doubt, the second man in the movement for independence, and the first in the legal codification of the Republic, on which he imprinted forever the stamp of his formalist, conservative spirit. On one of the many occasions when the general planned to resign, he had said to Santander that he was abandoning the presidency with confidence because "I am leaving you here, my other self, and perhaps my better self." He had never, either by reasoned intention or by force of circumstance, placed so much confidence in any man. It was he who distinguished Santander with the title, the Man of Law. Nevertheless, the person who had merited all this had been living in exile in Paris for the past 2 years because of his unproved complicity in a plot to assassinate the general. This is what happened. On September 25th, 1828, at the stroke of midnight, 12 civilians and 26 soldiers forced the great door of Government House in Santa Fe de Bogota, cut the throats of 2 of the president's bloodhounds, wounded several sentries, slashed the arm of Captain Andres Ibarra with a saber, shot to death the Scotsman Colonel William Ferguson, a member of the British Legion, and an aide-de-camp to the president, who had called him as valiant as Caesar, and reached the presidential bedroom, shouting, "Long live liberty!" and "Death to the tyrant!" The rebels would justify the attempt by referring to the extraordinary powers of obvious dictatorial intent that the general had assumed 3 months before in order to thwart the Santanderist victory at the Ocoña Convention. The vice presidency of the Republic, which Santander had occupied for 7 years, was abolished. Santander told a friend about it in a sentence typical of his personal style. "I have had the pleasure of being buried under the ruins of the Constitution of 1821. He was then 36 years old. He had been named plenipotentiary minister to Washington, but had postponed his departure several times, perhaps in anticipation of the conspiracy's success. The general and Manuela Sáenz were just beginning a night of reconciliation. They had spent the weekend in the village of Soacha, 2.5 leagues away, and had returned on Monday in separate coaches after a lover's quarrel that was more virulent than usual because he remained deaf to her warnings of a plot to kill him, something everyone was talking about and only he refused to believe. He had not accepted the insistent messages he sent to her house that night from San Carlos Palace across the street, but at 9 o'clock, after 3 very urgent messages, she put waterproof boots over her shoes, covered her head with a shawl, and crossed the street flooded by rain. She found him floating face up in the fragrant waters of the bath, unattended by José Palacios, and if she did not believe he was dead, it was because she had often seen him meditating in that state of grace. He recognized her footsteps and spoke without opening his eyes. "There is going to be an insurrection," he said. Irony did not disguise her anger. "Congratulations," she said. "There could be 10, since you give such a cordial welcome to the warnings." "I only believe in portents," he said. He permitted himself the joke because his chief of staff, who had already told the conspirators the password for the night so they could deceive the palace guard, had given him his word that the conspiracy had failed, and therefore he was in good humor as he rose from the tub. "Don't worry," he said. "It seems the little fairies got cold feet." He was naked, and she was half-dressed, and they were just beginning their love play in bed when they heard the first shouts, the first shots, and the cannons thundering against loyal barracks. Manuela helped him to dress as quickly as possible, put her waterproof boots on his feet since the general had sent his only pair of boots to be polished, and helped him to escape out the balcony with a saber and a pistol, but no protection against the eternal rain. As soon as he reached the street, he pointed his cocked pistol at an approaching shadow. "Who goes there?" It was his steward, returning home, grief-stricken by the news that they had killed his master. Resolved to share his fate to the end, José Palacios hid with him under Carmen Bridge in the brambles under the San Agustin River until loyal troops quelled the upspring. With the same shrewdness and courage she had already demonstrated during other historic emergencies, Manuela Sanz received the attackers who forced the bedroom door. They asked for the president, and she replied that he was in the council room. They asked why the door to the balcony was open on a wintry night, and she said she had opened it to see what the noises were in the street. They asked why the bed was warm, and she said she had lain down without undressing to wait for the president. As she played for time with her parsimonious replies, she puffed great clouds of smoke from the cheapest kind of wagon driver's cigar to cover the fresh scent of cologne that still lingered in the room. A tribunal presided over by General Rafael Urdaneta established that General Santander was the secret intelligence behind the conspiracy and condemned him to death. His enemies would say that the sentence was more than fair, not so much for Santander's culpability in the assassination attempt as for his cynicism in being the first to appear in the main square to embrace and congratulate the president, who sat on horseback in the drizzling rain, without a shirt and with his tunic ripped and soaked through, surrounded by the cheers of the troops and the common people who arrived en masse from the poor suburbs, clamoring for the death of the assassins. "All the conspirators will be punished to some degree," the general said in a letter to Field Marshal Sucre. "Santander is the principal one, but also the most fortunate, because my generosity protects him." And, in fact, exercising his absolute powers, he commuted the death sentence to exile in Paris. On the other hand, Admiral José Prudencio Padilla, imprisoned in Santa Fe de Bogotá for a failed rebellion in the Cartagena de Indias, was shot on insufficient evidence. José Palacios did not know when his master's dreams about General Santander were real and when they were imaginary. Once, in Guayaquil, he said he dreamed about Santander's holding an open book on his round belly, but instead of reading, he tore out the pages and ate them one by one, taking great delight in chomping them with as much noise as if he were a goat. Another time, in Cucuta, he dreamed he saw him covered with cockroaches. Another time, on the country estate of Monserrate in Santa Fe de Bogotá, he woke up screaming because he dreamed that while they were having lunch together, General Santander plucked out his own eyeballs because they interfered with his eating and placed them on the table. And so, at dawn near Guaduas, When the general said he had dreamed once again about Santander, Jose Palacios did not even ask for the plot of the dream, but tried instead to console him with reality. "There's a whole ocean between him and us," he said. But the general cut him off with a sharp glance. "Not any more," he said. "I'm certain that stupid bastard Joaquin Mosquera will let him come back." That thought had tormented him since his last return to the country, when his definitive renunciation of power presented itself as a question of honor. "I prefer exile or death to the dishonor of leaving my glory in the hands of the Academy of San Bartolome," he said to Jose Palacios. Nevertheless, the antidote contained its own poison, for the closer he came to the final decision, the more certain he grew that as soon as he was gone, General Santander, the most eminent graduate of that den of quibbling lawyers, would be called home from exile. "That one's really a slippery bastard," he said. He had no trace of fever, and he felt so strong he asked Jose Palacios for pen and paper, put on his spectacles, and wrote 6 lines to Manuela Sands in his own hand. This was bound to seem strange even to someone who was as accustomed as Jose Palacios to his impulsive actions, and could be understood only as a portent or an attack, or an attack of unendurable inspiration. For it not only contradicted his decision on the previous Friday never to write another letter for the rest of his life, but it was also contrary to his custom of waking his secretaries at any hour to attend to back correspondence, or to dictate a proclamation, or to put in order the ideas that occurred to him in the ruminations of his insomnia. It seemed even stranger, since the letter was of no apparent urgency, and he added only a rather cryptic sentence to his parting advice. "Be careful what you do, for if you're not, your ruination will be the ruination of us both." He wrote it in his slapdash way, as if he had given it no thought, and when he finished, he continued to sway in his hammock, engrossed, holding the letter in his hand. "There is great power in the irresistible force of love," he sighed without warning. "Who said that?" "Nobody," said Jose Palacios. He did not know how to read or write, and he had refused to learn, with the simple argument that there was no greater wisdom than a donkey's. But on the other hand, he could remember any sentence he had ever heard, and he did not remember that one. "Then I said it myself," said the general. "But let's say it was Field Marshal Sucre." No one was better suited than Fernando for those times of crisis. He was the most willing and patient of the general's many clerks, although not the most brilliant, and he bore with stoicism the arbitrariness of his schedule or the irritability of his insomnia. The general would wake Fernando at any hour to have him read aloud from a dull book or take notes on urgent extemporations, which ended in the trash the next morning. The general had fathered no children during his countless nights of love, although he said he had proofs he was not sterile, and on the death of his brother he had taken charge of Fernando. He had sent him with outstanding letters of introduction to the military academy at Georgetown, where General Lafayette expressed the sentiments of admiration and respect his uncle inspired in him. Later, he attended the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He was not the successor of the general perhaps had dreamed of, for academic subjects bored him, and he was delighted to exchange them for life in the open air and the sedentary arts of gardening. When he completed his studies, the general called him back to Santa Fe de Bogota and soon discovered his virtues as secretary, not only because of his beautiful handwriting and his command of spoken and written English, but also because he was unique in his ability to invent the kinds of devices used in serialized novels to keep the reader in suspense. And when he read aloud, he would improvise audacious episodes to add spice to soporific paragraphs. Like everyone in the service of the general, Fernando had suffered his moment of misfortune when he attributed to Cicero a sentence by Demosthenes that his uncle later cited in a speech. He was more severe with his nephew than with the others, since he was who he was, but he pardoned him before he had completed his punishment. Colonel Joaquin Posada Gutierrez, the governor of the province, had ridden out 2 days ahead of the traveling party to announce their arrival in the towns where they would spend the night and to caution the authorities regarding the serious state of the general's health. But those who saw him arrive in Guaduas on Monday afternoon accepted as true the persistent rumor that the governor's reports, and even the journey itself, were nothing more than a political ruse. The general was invincible once more. He rode into town on the main street, his shirt unbuttoned and a gypsy bandana tied around his head to absorb the perspiration, waving his hat amid the cheers and the fireworks and the church bell that drowned out the music, sitting on a nimble-footed mule that once and for all stripped the parade of any pretension to solemnity. The only house where the windows stayed closed was the nuns' academy, and in the afternoon the rumor would fly that they had forbidden the girls to participate in the welcome, but he advised those who told him the story not to believe convent gossip. On the previous night, Jose Palacios had given the shirt the general wore when he sweat out his fever to an orderly for laundering. He in turn gave it to the soldiers who went down to the river at dawn to wash clothes, but when it was time to leave, no one knew anything about it. During the trip to Guaduas, and even while the fiesta was going on, Jose Palacios had succeeded in establishing that the innkeeper had taken the unwashed shirt so that the miracle-working Indian could demonstrate his powers. And when the general returned, Jose Palacios informed him of the innkeeper's breach of faith, reminding him that he had no shirts other than the one he was wearing. He took the news with a certain philosophical resignation. "Superstitions are harder to uproot than love," he said. "The strange thing is we haven't had a fever since last night," said Jose Palacios. "What if the witch doctor is a real magician?" He found no immediate reply, and he allowed himself to be carried away by deep reflection as he swayed in the hammock to the rhythm of his thoughts. "The truth is, I haven't had another headache," he said. "My mouth doesn't taste bitter, and I don't feel as if I were about to fall off a tower." But in the end, he slapped his knees and sat up with a resolute movement. "Don't put any more confusion in my head," he said. 2 servants carried a large pot of boiling water with aromatic leaves into the bedroom, and Jose Palacios prepared the evening bath, confident the general would soon go to bed because of his weariness after a day of traveling. But the bath grew cold while he dictated a letter to Gabriel Camacho, the husband of his niece Valentina Palacios, and his agent in Caracas for the sale of the Aroa mines, a copper deposit he had inherited from his parents. Even he did not seem to have a clear idea of his destination, for in one sentence he said he was going to Curaçao, while Camacho brought this piece of business to a successful conclusion, and in another he asked that he write to him in London in care of Sir Robert Wilson, with a copy of Mr. Maxwell Hyslop in Jamaica, to be sure he received one of the letters even if the other was lost. For many people, above all his secretaries and copyists, the Aroa mines were another of his feverish ravings. He had shown so little interest in them that for years they had been worked by casual operators. He remembered the mines toward the end of his life, when money began to grow scarce, but he could not sell them to an English company because his titles were not clear. That was the beginning of a legendary legal imbroglio that would go on for 2 years after his death. In the midst of wars, political conflicts, personal hatreds, everyone knew what he meant when the general said, "my case." In his opinion, the Aroa mines were the only case. The letter he dictated in Guaduas to Don Gabriel Camacho left his nephew with the mistaken impression that they would not leave for Europe until the dispute was settled, and Fernando mentioned this later when he was playing cards with the other officers. "Then we will never leave," said Colonel Wilson. "My father has reached the point where he wonders if that copper exists in the real world." "The fact that no one's seen them doesn't mean the mines don't exist," replied Captain Andres Ibarro. "They exist," said General Carreño, "in the Department of Venezuela," Wilson replied in disgust. "At this stage, I even wonder if Venezuela exists." He could not hide his vexation. Wilson had come to believe the general was not fond of him and kept him in his entourage only out of consideration for his father, to whom he was forever grateful for his defense of American emancipation in the English Parliament. Through the disloyalty of a former aide-de-camp, a Frenchman, he learned that the general had said, "Wilson needs to spend some time in the schools of difficulties, not to mention adversity and misery." Colonel Wilson had not been able to determine if that was, in fact, what the general had said, but in any case, he believed that just one of his battles would qualify him as a graduate of all three schools. He was 26 years old, and 8 years earlier, when he finished his studies at Westminster and Sandhurst, his father had sent him to serve the general. He had been his aide-de-camp at the Battle of Junin, and he was the man who carried the first draft of the Bolivian Constitution on muleback from Chuquisaca to La Paz, along 360 leagues of narrow precipice. When he said goodbye, the general told him he had to be in La Paz in 21 days at the latest. Wilson snapped to attention. "I'll be there in 20, Excellency." It took him 19. He had decided to return to Europe with the general, but each day increased his certainty that he would always find another reason for deferring the trip. His mention of the Arau mines, after more than 2 years of not even using them as a pretext for anything, was a disheartening sign for Wilson. José Palacios reheated the water after the letter had been dictated, but the general did not take a bath and continued his aimless walking, declaiming poetry in a voice that resounded throughout the house. He went on to poems he had written that only José Palacios knew about. Several times he passed the gallery where his officers were playing ropilla, the American name for Galician lansquenet, which he too had played once. He would stop for a moment to watch over each officer's shoulder, draw conclusions regarding their progress, and continue walking. "I don't know how you can waste your time on such a boring game," he said. Nevertheless, on one of his many turns around the house, he could not resist the temptation of asking Captain Ibarro to allow him to take his place at the table. He did not possess the patience good gamblers have. He was aggressive and a poor loser, but he was also astute and fast and knew how to put himself on equal footing with his subordinates. On that occasion, with General Carreño as his partner, he played 6 games and lost all of them. He threw the cards on the table. "This game is shit," he said. "Who's brave enough to try hombre?" They all were. He won 3 games in a row. His humor improved, and he tried to ridicule the way Colonel Wilson played. Wilson took it well, but made use of the general's enthusiasm to gain an advantage, and he did not lose again. The general became tense. His lips hardened and turned pale, and the eyes, set deep under bushy eyebrows, burned with the savage brilliance of other times. He did not speak again, and a pernicious cough interfered with his concentration. It was past 12 o'clock when he stopped the game. "The wind's been blowing on me all night," he said. They carried the table to a more sheltered spot, but he continued losing. He asked them to quiet the fifes that could be heard playing at some nearby fiesta, but the fifes continued to sound over the din of the crickets. He changed his seat. He put a pillow on his chair so he could sit higher and be more comfortable. He drank an infusion of linden blossoms to relieve his cough. He played several games while walking from one end of the gallery to the other, but he continued losing. Wilson kept his clear, embittered eyes on him, but he did not deign to look back. "The deck is marked. This deck is marked," he said. "The deck is yours, General," said Wilson. It was, in fact, one of his, but still he examined it card by card, and at last he had it changed. Wilson gave him no rest. The cricket stopped. There was a long silence shaken by a humid breeze that brought the first scent of the burning valleys to the gallery, and a rooster crowed 3 times. "That rooster's crazy," said Ibarra. "I can't be later than 2:00. Without taking his eyes off the cards, the general ordered in a surly voice, "Nobody moves from here, damn it!" No one breathed. General Carreno, who was following the game with more apprehension than interest, remembered the longest night of his life, 2 years before, when they were waiting in Bucaramanga for the results of the Ocaña convention. They had begun to play at 9:00 and did not finish until 11 the next morning, when his companions agreed to let the general win 3 games in a row. Fearing another test of endurance that night in Guaras, General Carreño signaled Colonel Wilson to begin to lose. Wilson ignored him. Then, when he asked for a 5-minute break, General Carreño followed him along the terrace and found him pissing his ammoniacal bitterness. Ammoniacal, like ammonia. Ammoniacal bitterness into the pots of geraniums. "Colonel Wilson," General Carreño ordered, "attention." Wilson replied without turning his head, "Wait until I finish." He finished with absolute serenity and turned around as he adjusted his trousers. "Begin to lose," General Carreño told him, "if only as an act of kindness to a friend in trouble." "I refuse to pay anyone such an insult," said Wilson, with a touch of irony. "That's an order," said Carreño. Wilson, standing at attention, looked down at him from his full height with imperial contempt. Then he returned to the table and began to lose. The general understood. "It isn't necessary for you to do it so badly, my dear Wilson," he said. "When all is said and done, it's time we went to sleep." He took his leave of everyone with a firm handshake, as he always did, when he got up from the card table, in order to show that the game had not altered his feelings, and he returned to the bedroom. Jose Palacios had fallen asleep on the floor, but he stood up when he saw him come in. The general stripped off all his clothes in a rush and began to sway in his hammock, his thoughts in a whirl. His respiration growing louder and harsher the more he thought. When he sank into the tub, he was shaking down to the marrow of his bones, but this time it was not fever or cold, but rage. "Wilson's a slippery bastard," he said. It was one of his worst nights. Jose Palacios disobeyed orders and warned the officers in case it proved necessary to call a doctor, and he kept him wrapped in sheets so he could sweat out the fever. He soaked through several of them, with momentary respites that only hurled him back into hallucinatory crisis. Several times he shouted, "Make those damn fifes be quiet!" But no one could help him this time, because the fifes had been silent since midnight. Later he discovered who was responsible for his prostration. "I was feeling fine," he said, "until I let all of you talk me into that fucking Indian with the shirt." The last stage of the journey to Honda was along a heart-stopping precipice through air like molten glass that only physical stamina and willpower like this could have endured after a night of agony. After the first few leagues, he had moved back from his usual position to ride beside Colonel Wilson, who knew to interpret the gesture as an invitation to forget the grievances of the gaming table, and who offered his arm as if he were a falconer for the general to rest his hand on. In that way, they made the descent together, Colonel Wilson moved by his courtesy, and the general using his last strength to struggle for breath, but sitting unbowed in the saddle. When the steepest stretch was over, he asked with a voice from another century, "What do you suppose London is like now?" Colonel Wilson looked at the sun, which was almost in the center of the sky, and said, "Very bad, General." He showed no surprise, but asked another question in the same voice. "And why is that?" "Because there at 6 in the evening, the worst time in London," said Wilson, "and a rain as filthy and dead as toad water must be falling, because spring is our sinister season." "Don't tell me you've conquered nostalgia," he said. "On the contrary, nostalgia has conquered me," said Wilson. "I no longer put up the slightest resistance to it." "Then do you or don't you want to go back?" "I don't know anything anymore, General," said Wilson. "I'm at the mercy of a destiny that isn't mine." The general looked straight into his eyes and said in amazement, "That's what I should be saying." When he spoke again, his voice and mood had changed. "Don't worry," he said. "Whatever happens, we will go to Europe, if for no other reason than to not deprive your father of the pleasure of seeing you." Then, after long reflection, he concluded, "And let me tell you one last thing, my dear Wilson. They can call you anything they like, except a slippery bastard." Accustomed to his gallant repentances, above all after a stormy card game or a victory in battle, Colonel Wilson yielded to him one more time. He continued to ride at a slow pace with the feverish hand of the most glorious invalid in the Americas clutching like a hunting falcon at his forearm, while the air began to boil and funereal birds circling above their heads had to be driven away like flies. On the most difficult part of the slope, they crossed paths with a crew of Indians carrying a party of European travelers in sedan chairs. Then, when they had almost completed the descent, a demented horseman passed them at full gallop, riding in the same direction they were taking. He wore a red hood that almost covered his face, and his haste was so disordered that Captain Ibarra's mule almost plunged over the edge in fright. And the general just had time to shout, "Watch where you're going, damn you!" He stared after him until he disappeared around the first bend, but was still watching for him each time he reappeared on the lower curves of the precipice. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they rode the crest of the last hill, and the horizon opened into a brilliant plain at the end of which the celebrated city of Honda lay dozing, with its bridge of Castilian stone spanning the great marshy river, with its walls in ruins and its church tower destroyed by an earthquake. The general contemplated the burning valley, but betrayed no emotion, except when he saw the rider in the red hood crossing the bridge at his unending gallop. Then the light he had seen in his dreams was rekindled. "Merciful God," he said, "the only explanation for that kind of speed is that he's carrying a letter for Cassandra, with the news that we've left." And that's the end of that chapter. All right, we are going to start chapter 3 on page 69, and we'll get just a few pages in for the rest of this section. So, page 69, chapter 3. Despite the warnings against any public demonstrations to mark his arrival, a high-spirited troop of horsemen rode out to welcome him in the port, and Governor Posada Gutierrez arranged 3 days of bands and fireworks. But rain ruined the fiesta before they even reached the streets of the commercial district. It was an inopportune downpour of devastating violence, which tore up the cobbles in the streets and sent water flooding through the poor neighborhoods, but the heat remained imperturbable. In the welter of greetings, someone repeated the eternal cliché, "It's so hot, here the hens lay fried eggs." For the next 3 days, this same disaster was repeated without any variation. During the torpor of siesta, a black cloud descended from the mountains, settled over the city, and burst open in an instant deluge. Then the sun shone again in a diaphanous sky, as merciless as before, while the civic brigades cleared the streets of the debris left by the flood, and the next day's black cloud began to form on the crest of the hills. At any hour of the day or night, indoors or out, one heard the panting of the heat. Prostrate with fever, the general could scarcely endure the official welcoming ceremony. The air was at a rolling boil in the salon of the town hall, but he managed a sermon worthy of a cautious bishop, which he spoke very slowly in an unwilling voice without getting up from the armchair. A 10-year-old girl wearing angel wings and a dress of ruffled organza choked with haste as she recited from memory an ode to the glories of the general. But she made a mistake, began again at the wrong place, became lost beyond all hope, and not knowing what else to do, stared at him in panic. The general gave her a smile of complicity and reminded her of the lines in a low voice. "The brilliance of his saber is the living reflection of his glory." In the early years of his power, the general missed no opportunity to give splendid banquets for a multitude of guests, whom he would urge to eat and to drink to the point of inebriation. From that sumptuous past, he still had his personal monogrammed place setting, which Jose Palacios would bring to dinner parties. At the reception in Honda, he agreed to sit in the place of honor, but he drank only a glass of port and just tasted the river turtle soup, which left an unpleasant flavor in his mouth. He withdrew early to the sanctuary Governor Posada Gutierrez had ready for him in his house, but the news that the mail from Santa Fe de Bogota was expected the next day drove away the little sleep that was left to him. Prey to apprehension after the 3-day respite, he began to think again about his misfortunes, and again he tormented Jose Palacios with idle questions. He wanted to know what had happened since he left, what the city would be like with a government different from his own, what life would be like without him. On one gloomy occasion he had said, "America is half a world gone mad." That first night in Honda, he had even more reason to believe this was so. He spent the night in suspense, plagued by mosquitoes because he refused to sleep with netting. At times he walked around and around the room talking to himself. At times he swayed with great lurching swings in the hammock. At times he rolled himself in a blanket and succumbed to his fever, almost shouting with delirium in a marshland of sweat. Jose Palacios stayed with him, answering his questions, telling him the exact hour and a minute every few seconds, without having to consult the 2 watches he wore on chains fastened to the buttonholes of his vest. He rocked the hammock when the general did not have the strength to do it himself, and drove away the mosquitoes with a cloth until at last he lulled him into a sleep that lasted over an hour. But he awoke with a start just before dawn when he heard the sound of animals and men's voices in the patio, and he went out in his nightshirt to receive the mail. His young Mexican aide-de-camp, Captain Agustin de Iturbide, who had been detained in Santa Fe de Bogota by a last-minute emergency, arrived with the mail carriers. He had with him a letter from Field Marshal Sucre, a heartfelt lament at not having arrived in time to say goodbye. There also arrived in the mail a letter written 2 days earlier by President Caicedo. Governor Posada Gutierrez came into the bedroom a short while later with clippings from the Sunday papers, and the general asked that he read the letters to him since the light was still too dim for his eyes. The news was Then on Sunday, the weather had cleared in Santa Fe de Bogota, and numerous families with their children invaded the horse-breeding farms with baskets of roast suckling pig, baked brisket, blood sausage with rice, potatoes, and melted cheese, and ate their lunch on the grass under a radiant sun that had not been seen in the city for ages. This May miracle had dissipated Saturday's tension. The students from the Academy of San Bartolome had taken to the streets once more with the all-too-familiar farce of symbolic executions, but to no effect. They dispersed in boredom before nightfall, and on Sunday they exchanged rifles for treble guitars and could be seen on the breeding farms singing bambucos among the crowds of people warming themselves in the sun until it rained again, without warning, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the fiesta was over. Posada Gutierrez interrupted his reading of the letter. "Nothing in this world can stain your glory," he said to the general. "No matter what they say, your excellency will continue to be the greatest Colombian anywhere on earth." "I don't doubt it," said the general, "if all I had to do was leave to make the sun shine again." The only item in Caicedo's letter to provoke him was that even the interim president of the Republic committed the abuse of calling Santander's followers liberals, as if it were official terminology. "I don't know where the demagogues got the right to call themselves liberals," he said. "They stole the word pure and simple, just as they steal everything they lay their hands on." He leaped from the hammock and continued to vent his anger to the governor as he paced off the room from one end to the other with his soldier strides. "The truth is, the only two parties here are those who are with me and those who are against me, and you know that better than anyone," he concluded. "And although they may not believe it, no one is more liberal than I am." Later, a personal emissary from the governor brought him the verbal message that Manuela Sanz had not written to him because the mail carriers had categorical instructions not to accept her letters. The message came from Manuela herself, who on the same date had sent the interim president a letter to protest the prohibition, which was the origin of a series of mutual provocations that would end in her exile and oblivion. Nevertheless, contrary to the expectations of Posada Gutierrez, who had first-hand knowledge of the stormy quarrels in that tormented love affair, the general smiled at the bad news. "These conflicts are the natural state of my amiable mad woman," he said. Jose Palacios did not hide his vexation at the lack of consideration shown in the programming of the 3 days in Honda. The most surprising invitation was to visit the silver mines in Santa Ana, 6 leagues away. But more surprising was that the general accepted, and much more surprising was that he went down to a subterranean gallery. Even worse, on the way back, despite his high fever and a head about to explode with migraine, he went swimming in a backwater of the river. The days were long gone when he would wager that he could cross a rushing torrent on the plains with one hand tied and still beat the most skillful swimmer. In any case, this time he swam for half an hour without tiring, but those who saw his scrawny ribs and rachitic legs did not understand how he stayed alive with so little body. On the last night, the municipal government held a gala ball in his honor, which he declined to attend because of fatigue after his excursion. Secluded in the bedroom with Fernando since 5 o'clock that afternoon, he dictated the reply to General Domingo Caicedo and had his nephew read aloud several more pages of Lima's gallant adventures, in some of which he had been the protagonist. Then he took a lukewarm bath and lay motionless in the hammock, listening to the strains of music wafting in from the ball in his honor. Jose Palacios thought he was asleep when he heard him say, "Do you remember that waltz?" He whistled several measures to remind the steward of the music, but he could not identify it. "It was the waltz they played the night we arrived in Lima from Chuquisaca," said the general. Jose Palacios did not remember it, but he would never forget the glorious night of February 8th, 1826. That morning, Lima had given them an imperial reception, and the general responded with a sentence he repeated without fail at every toast. "There is not a single Spaniard left in the vast territory of Peru." That day confirmed the independence of the huge continent which he proposed to turn, according to his own words, into the most immense, or most extraordinary, or most invincible league of nations the world had ever seen. For him, the emotions of the fiesta were associated with the waltz he had asked them to repeat as many times as necessary, so that every lady in Lima would have the opportunity to dance to it with him. His officers, who wore the most dazzling uniforms in the city had ever seen, did their best to follow his example, for they all waltzed admirably, a memory that endured in the hearts of their partners much longer than any glories of war. On the last night in Honda, they opened the fiesta with the victory waltz, and he waited in the hammock for them to repeat it. But when it was clear they would not, he leaped up, put on the same riding clothes he had worn on the excursion to the mines, and presented himself at the ball without being announced. He danced for almost 3 hours, and had them repeat the piece each time he changed partners, attempting, perhaps, to constitute the splendor of long ago out of the ashes of his memories. Gone were the years of illusion when everyone dropped with exhaustion and only he and his last partner were left to dance until dawn in the deserted ballroom. Dancing was, for him, so dominant a passion that he would dance without a partner when one was not at hand, or he would dance alone to music he whistled himself, and he would express his moments of great jubilation by dancing on the dining-room table. On the last night in Honda, his strength was so diminished that during intermissions he had to inhale the fumes from the handkerchief soaked with cologne in order to revive, but he danced with so much enthusiasm and such youthful skill that without intending to, he confounded the tales of his fatal illness. Not long after midnight, when he returned to the house, they reported that a woman was waiting for him in the reception room. Elegant and haughty, emitting the fragrance of spring, she wore a long-sleeved velvet dress, riding boots of the finest Cordovan leather, and the silk-veiled hat of a medieval lady. The general made her a formal bow, intrigued by the nature and hour of the visit. Without saying a word, she held up a reliquary hanging around her neck on a long chain, and he recognized it in astonishment. I think we'll stop there, since the fridge is making noise now. Apologies for all the interruptions today. It can't be good in one room, it can't be good in the other room, but we did get a section going. I will edit it to the best of my abilities, which are not great, but it will get done. We're going to start next time on page 76, right near the top, the first bit of dialogue at the top of that page, so hopefully that will help you. Or honestly, if the copy is just a little bit different, we're starting with him saying Miranda Lindsay. So there you go. That's where we will pick up next time in The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I will see you soon, again this week, probably just 2 times this week, but thanks for joining me. I will see you. Bye.